Thanks for joining us this afternoon for the latest in our TSC webinar series. We will begin shortly, but give a few more minutes to let people join us. All right, it is just 1 past the hour, so we will go ahead and kick things off. Thanks again for joining us for the latest in the TSC webinar series, Exploring OnBase. We are very excited to have everyone with us this afternoon and excited to see what Victor has prepared for us. And to kick us off and start out some intros, I will hand it over to Jack Roberts, our fearless leader and founder of TSC. Jack?
Thanks, Jamin. Welcome, everybody. Glad that you could attend today's webinar about Hyland APIs and beyond. We are excited to show you and give you some use cases about how you can extend your OnBase solution and make it more user-friendly and more adaptable. One thing that Victor's going to talk about that we often kind of collaborate together on is imagination. You know, a lot of people say, well, this is our box that we live in and we can't do much else. I mean, we have to be defined in this. If you have an imagination and you can have APIs to call on, then you're going to be able to really expand your solution and not necessarily have to work harder but smarter about how we do some of this stuff. So what we were fortunate in doing was to be able to persuade Victor to be our VP of solutions and really come up with some outstanding APIs and different supplemental products that we offer with OnBase, with other products. But the big thing is Victor comes with a wealth of solution experience. He's a programming guru and an all-around good dude. As you can see in his picture, he's Mr. Cool. We appreciate you, Victor, for stepping up today and entertaining us all for another hour. So with that, I will turn it over to you, sir.
Thanks, Jack. And so my name's Victor Podolsky. I am the VP of Solutions here at TSC. By trade, I am a .NET programmer, but I know several programming languages. I've built applications for tons of different platforms, some of which you probably have never even heard of. And so when it comes to the OnBase APIs or APIs in general, it's just like Jack said, I kind of have that imagination where if you can think it up, I can figure out how to make it work, and it becomes just a matter of time versus money. And so as we go through this presentation, I'm definitely going to start us off. Now we're through introductions. We're going to start off just getting a baseline on what APIs are. We're going to talk about why do I need the APIs? What are they used for? What kind of things can I do with them? We'll talk about the Hyland APIs. I'll actually list out what some of those APIs are. I can only list some of them out because it would take far too long to list them all. We'll talk about what else can I do, because there are a lot of solutions that I do here at TSC that don't necessarily tie into the Hyland APIs, but they do tie into the OnBase product. And so later on, I'll definitely have a couple case studies that'll talk about a couple of those solutions. And with the case studies, I'll definitely talk about specific examples, specific customer solutions that I have programmed in the past. And then I am a huge fan of question and answer. And so I will be taking questions throughout. I believe that there is a chat window that you can put the questions into, and one of my lovely assistants will read those questions to me. I will answer them, and then they will actually type the answers in the chat window as well. so that you can have those in case you missed it during the presentation. But definitely feel free to ask questions now, or as you'll see later, you can ask me anytime. I love talking code. As Jack will tell you, I could talk code all day, every day, all night. And so with that, let's talk about what an API is. And so an API, or an application programming interface, or application programmer's interface, depending on where you look it up, is a way really for a programmer to talk to an application from the comforts of their code. And so I'm going to keep a programmer inside of their code. I'm going to allow them to actually interact with other applications. Whether you know it or not, many of the applications that you have installed on any computer have APIs. And so Microsoft Windows has several APIs. I can deal with the file system, I can deal with users, things like that. Microsoft Office definitely has APIs. I've actually tapped into those several times for OnBase solutions to generate Word documents or even Excel documents. And then, of course, even OnBase has APIs. Different applications will provide APIs for different platforms. And so OnBase is a great example of this, where if you ever talk to anyone in the OnBase community about how to extend OnBase, you could talk to 3 different people and hear about 3 different APIs. And so depending on where you're programming it, what your needs are, even sometimes just what platform you're programming from. Are you doing .NET or Java? There could be different APIs available to you. And so how do these APIs work? Well, we start with, you have this programmer. And this programmer guy, he really likes to write his code. And so he's going to write some custom applications for your enterprise. It might be a website, it could be a desktop app, maybe even a mobile app. In using the application and the code that he writes, he also needs to interact with OnBase because part of the application is held in his code, but then there's stuff inside of OnBase that he needs to do. Maybe he needs to refer to a document. Maybe he needs to process a document in a workflow. Or there could be other things going on in the OnBase system. And so now I have to have both of these applications open at the same time. And so early 2000s, we solved this problem by allowing dual monitors. Now I can have both applications open, and I can just, swivel my head and go between those applications. A big problem with this is there are several drawbacks. One of the most commonly mentioned is going to be your data validation. If I have to enter information in both of those applications, there could be user entry error. And so now, even though I thought I typed my name correctly in both applications, maybe I mistyped it and now it's incorrect. The number one drawback from all of this, though, is going to be multitasking. It takes me time, even if I'm not calculating it, all the time, it's going to take me time to go between those 2 applications. And depending on what my job is and what I have to do, that could be very costly in the long run. And so we get into this mode of too many applications. We're trying so hard to, interact with everything, close out of every application, update every application, and there's just too many applications. And so what if, instead of interacting with all of those applications, what if we could have the code, the website, that custom application, talk to OnBase? And so we have all that functionality built into the custom app. We allow the code to do all the work. And so when we go into that application and we do our thing, it's actually going to go ahead and update the other application for us. The code's going to do the other work for us. And so this leads right into, why do I need APIs? Well, number one, I can replace that multitasking, but there's other purposes too. I can actually use an API to reduce the number of steps workers have to do. Sometimes I have a set of workers and they have a very specific job that they need to do. They don't need to see all the bells and whistles of the OnBase client. They need to go to a website, type in a couple keywords, upload a document, and that's it. Or maybe they need to retrieve a specific set of documents, and while they're looking at that, they have to interact with another application. I can write something to reduce those steps down and make it streamlined. It allows for custom processing steps. We'll see in one of the examples later of I could be in the OnBase software and I could go out and update another application just by interacting with the different APIs available. And of course, I've already talked about it several times, but a customized interface, custom user experience. I can tailor how the users interact with the software just by programming to those APIs and looking at what's available. Again, reducing those steps, reducing the multitasking, and really streamlining the work of those users. And so OnBase has APIs. OnBase has several APIs. In my background, I was working at Hyland for several years, and I was there when DM Core X was first built. There's DM Core X, there's Hyland Services, there's a thick client API, there's automation APIs, workflow, workview, document composition. Many of the modules within the OnBase software have APIs available. The most commonly known one to many is the Unity API. Another one that's just coming out and has just been out in the last few years is the Hyland REST APIs. And so we've talked about REST. Hyland REST APIs, what is it? Well, this is our latest API from Hyland. It's a REST implementation. Translation, it's built for the web. When this API was constructed, it was web first. We're going to make web calls. We're going to interact with it through the web. That's where it differs from DM Core X or Unity. Those APIs, although some of you know, those were used in the web technologies. The REST API was really built for the web, where those other APIs, they were used in web applications, but not necessarily written to take full utilization of the web. The REST API right now has document, administrative, workview, and workflow functionality available. And I'm sure that list will grow as time goes on and they keep enhancing it. The Hyland REST API, though, an important note is it's going to require different components. And so there's a lot of different installs. There's a different kind of infrastructure that we have to build with the OnBase software to support this API. In terms of OnBase functionality, it's also relatively new. And so there can be some hiccups, some hurdles that we have to jump through there. Because of this, I want to talk about the Unity API. And specifically later, I'll even talk about a solution that I've written with TSC that really helps customers utilize that web type interface through the Unity API. And so the Unity API, it's been around over a decade. It has both libraries for Java and for .NET, and it's an object-oriented data model. Now, object-oriented, it sounds like it's kind of outdated, like that's old school stuff. It's really not. That's still very common programming design today. The best part about this API is it talks to the application server that we all know and love. And so that same application server that we use for so many other pieces of the OnBase software is going to be used by this API. So just by having that installed, or we can have a separate directory installed for it, we can now run that application server and have that service the Unity API. My favorite part of the Unity API, the diagnostic console can be used for troubleshooting. As a programmer, this is huge for me because I can actually write my own custom messages to that diagnostic console from within this API. And so if I need to do troubleshooting, if I need to troubleshoot the application because something's gone wrong, I can write out messages and just look at that console and see what's going on. The Unity API, you can create a REST wrapper around this API. And so I've talked about REST. What is REST? For anyone who doesn't know, it stands for Representational State Transfer. It's a really fancy way of saying we're going to update and we're going to look at some specific state of some type of object. It's designed for the World Wide Web. It uses XML or JSON to transfer data. And so many of us probably have used XML at some point. We can also use a JSON object. I'll show you an example of what that JSON object looks like. and it allows us to transfer that data. Now, if we look here, there are 4 main methods to this API. We have get, post, put, and delete. Posting, we're just creating an object. Getting, we're reading the information, just looking at what's available. Put, we're going to update. Delete, pretty self-explanatory, we're going to delete. One of the things you may not know about these types of calls is you use them on a daily basis. I would be willing to bet that everybody in attendance here makes a get call at least once a day. Why do I say that? If you ever open a web browser, when you open that web browser and you type in that address, it is making a get call to some other web server to put up that page that you just went to look at on the internet. And so that's where you can really see these methods, they were built for the web. Even a web browser is making those types of calls. On a
So Victor,
website, yes.
we do have a question, and the question is, does the diagnostic console from the previous slide replace the old-fashioned log files?
It can. It can absolutely replace it. And so the question was about the diagnostic console. Does it replace log files? You can log to the console and only log to the console. You can also create log files. I often look at the details of the solution to make my best decision as to should I do one, the other, or both. And there are cases where I will do both.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem. And so in talking about these web methods again, they equate to something called CRUD. Some of you may have heard of this, some of you might not. What in the world is CRUD? Well, CRUD is actually just talking about the state of an object. Create an object, read an object, update an object, delete an object. Representational state, REST, a description or detail of the state of an object. I'm working with objects. The transfer method is where REST does the web. CRUD doesn't have to do the web. It could just be talking to a database. But it's the same kind of principles used again. REST in OnBase, when I'm dealing in OnBase, the state or those objects that I'm talking about, they're really either document objects or it's objects within the WorkView application. And so we may create documents, we may create keywords, notes, annotations. Any of that, we're actually just dealing with the state of a document. You can also interact with the documents and objects in workflow. I can actually update the state of a document in workflow through the API. I can execute ad hoc tasks through the API. It has a lot of power in that ability of doing workflow without actually being in workflow. I've set objects, that automatically implies WorkView. An interesting note on the Unity API, like the DM Core X, it was once said that it was a one-to-one for functionality of the web client. If you could do something in the web client, you could probably do it in this API. And so that tells you there's a lot of functionality available there. So what can I do with this? I can create custom user interfaces. I can simplify steps for a group of users. I can make sure that they're very pinpointed in what they're doing. I can provide access to the OnBase system for people who don't typically use OnBase. One of the most common requests I get is, I need to expose some OnBase documents on my web portal to users who are never going to log into OnBase. With the APIs, I can do that. You can build OnBase functionality into that website or any other application that has a way for us to tap into it. You can integrate OnBase with other applications. I could start giving a list, but there are so many applications out there that I've integrated OnBase with. If you think of Guidewire, Salesforce, Epic, even custom line of business applications, you can integrate OnBase with those. You can create custom logic so that you're working with both of those applications at once. You can interact with the file system or a secondary database. And of course, you can absolutely combine the OnBase API with any number of APIs to have all of that in one code base. And then my favorite part about the APIs is extending the functionality of OnBase to do stuff that maybe it wasn't ever intended to do, but by doing it, I'm helping my business be more efficient. And so let's see some real examples here. And so the first one I got to talk about is our TSC REST wrapper. This is a wrapper that we can customize to specific needs of a website, but it provides a REST interface, and we actually use the Unity API behind the covers on this. And so here's just a simple little screenshot of some code. Developer, always nice to show some code. All this screen is actually doing after I looked at it is demonstrating that this is in fact a web call. You can see the word HTTP post in there. And then it's actually just grabbing a bunch of data from a configuration file. So just like we configure OnBase, we can actually set up configuration for our custom wrapper here. And so how does this work? We start with a JSON packet. This is an example of a JSON object. I can very simply say, I need a document type, a date, a file format, and the keywords. And I can take that packet and then send it through the internet to a server that is going to process that request. It's going to have my wrapper application on it. And when it goes through that wrapper, it's going to talk to the OnBase APIs and update OnBase. And so in the next case, I'm pointing to the OnBase server. The nice thing here is I said server, but I didn't put a server per se on the screen because I could have OnBase on the same server as the wrapper. I could have it on different machines. I can really customize what the infrastructure is going to look like so that if I have to have the server on the outside of the DMZ, I can do things like that, and I can really help engage the security department to make sure I'm following all the right protocols of the enterprise. And so it's very flexible in how it's installed, where it's installed. It just needs access to that application server so that it can send the API calls. Configuration-wise, this is actually a sample configuration from one of those servers. And all I've got here is I'm telling it where I want to upload documents. I'm giving it the API URL. I'm giving it my data source, my username, my super secure password. Am I going to use query metering? And so I can customize this wrapper to use query metering or to use regular licensing, concurrent clients. My diagnostics level, I'm big on troubleshooting. So in a lot of cases, I write custom messages and I actually use different levels so that I'm not always writing a ton of things to the diagnostics console. And then below that is an interesting configuration here. This one is actually doing archival. So I needed a way to map MIME types of documents coming in through the internet to OnBase file formats. And so
Hey,
those
Victor,
numbers.
could you explain briefly what query metering is, please?
Absolutely. Query metering is OnBase's way of allowing users in any number to connect to the OnBase system and be able to retrieve documents or do OnBase functionality. And so what you typically think of for this is I'm going to open up the OnBase system to public users. And so a lot of times it's a publicly facing interface, a publicly facing website. And because I don't know how many users it is, and because those users aren't typically in OnBase, there's a special type of licensing that's actually restricted just by the number of queries. And a query is when I'm getting back a list of documents. So every list of documents I pull back is one query. And so did that kind of answer that question?
Absolutely, yeah. So a common use case then might be when we're serving up information in a context where the user doesn't even realize that OnBase is involved.
Oh, absolutely.
Great.
I've worked with the government before where we were displaying documents out of the OnBase system that were public information, and the website never said it was coming from OnBase, but they wrote an API to talk to the OnBase system. And because it was a government, it was opened up to all the constituents of that government. And so there was possibly thousands of users connecting. And the last thing that customer wanted to do was purchase thousands of concurrent client licenses for all of them. And so returning to the file types, when I'm interacting like that, I need to map back to my OnBase terms. And so all of those numbers are the OnBase file formats. The really powerful thing about this type of configuration, I need to archive a PowerPoint now. PowerPoint is not set up in this configuration. All I would have to do is add my row to the settings, possibly refresh my API wrapper, and right away I'm now supporting that file format as long as it's configured in the OnBase software. And so whenever I need to add a new mapping, it's just as easy as adding a row, making sure it's configured inside of OnBase. The TSC wrapper is written in C#. I'm a C# guy, so I like to write a lot of my code in that. It is .NET. The last wrapper I produced, I believe, was .NET 5, might have been 3, but it can easily be updated to 5. And it communicates using just GET and POST calls. One of the things you will see a lot with different programmers is they don't necessarily use the put and deletes, because the POST method can really handle the same type of functionality as those other two. And so it's kind of on the programmer to follow that. Yes.
Sorry, Victor, just a quick question. Is the wrapper for storing the documents, archiving them, retrieving them, or both?
Both. So the case that I was showing more the archival side, but I have definitely have a function already written to retrieve documents from OnBase through this wrapper.
Awesome.
The wrapper is completely configurable. Here's your configuration. And that file is just called an app.json. JSON, that word again. This is actually a JSON file. And so again, you can see it's nice, it's concise, not a lot of characters. It gets to the point on what I'm configuring. And then of course, this can be extended. Talking with TSC, any of your salespeople, I'm sure they'll get me on the phone. I love to talk about this. If there's other things that this wrapper needs to do, it can be extended to do those things. Can also be extended to do other types of calls and any .NET functionality. The absolute most awesome thing about this wrapper, I told you it was written in C#. I can call it from anything that can make a REST call. And so up here, I put C#, Java, and JavaScript, because those are all the languages that currently utilize our TSC wrapper. But there is nothing stopping me from using this in a WordPress site, or another PHP type site, or Ruby, or even just curl commands on a command line. If I can make a REST call, I could interact with this wrapper. And so it really does open up the possibilities, and it makes it so much nicer to integrate, because now I only have .NET and Java libraries, but I use a totally different language for everything else. Well, if I can make those web calls, I don't have to have my developers learn anything new. They just have to learn the web calls for this particular wrapper. And so it makes it so easy to integrate different types of developers. Troubleshooting, there's always Fiddler. Fiddler is a great utility by Telerik. It will capture web calls, allow you to see things. But the diagnostics console, I can absolutely use the diagnostics console, log to it, send my exceptions, things like that there, so that I can see what's going on. And then my favorite tool to use when I'm developing this wrapper is Postman. Because when I'm coding the wrapper, I just need to put the JSON object for that call together and send it and see if it's giving me the results I believe I should get. And so Postman allows me to do that in a very nice framework where I can even save those posts and I can actually replay them anytime I want, creating test plans, things like that, so that this wrapper is easy to tell that it's functioning properly. And all of these tools, well, the diagnostics console comes from Hyland with OnBase. The other two tools are freeware, or they're free on the internet to be able to download and use. And so my next section, I'm going to get away from the OnBase APIs a little bit and talk about preprocessors. I need to process data before I process the data inside of OnBase to process the data there. Processing data, OnBase processors, cold, diff, directory import, all deal with data in a very specific way. There is some flexibility, but as many people have found, especially judging by the number of these I've written, you find those limitations pretty quick. A preprocessor can then be used to take in the format that you currently have and reformat it so that it can go into OnBase easily. Typically, you'll hear OnBase talk about the %I, %O. These are those applications. We're actually creating console applications. And I know this was a topic among my developer friends. They couldn't believe I still write a bunch of console applications, but they're very handy and very useful for specifically this purpose. And so a case study here is combining files. I had a customer hand me a spreadsheet with employee information. It had the employee number, name, department, maybe a manager, maybe what year they started with the company, and all this information about that person. Then they had this directory pertaining to the employee. The folder was just named by the employee ID. When I go to that directory, it's just files. There's no index file to tell me what's in that directory. There's nothing there for me to be able to import those documents with OnBase by default. And so I needed to import all those documents, but I needed to import them with the keywords, including the file name, employee ID, employee name, department, and all of those other ones that I talked about. And so here, the spreadsheet could be used for an autofill if we want. We could actually import that as an autofill keyword set. And then we could write a preprocessor or something to actually import the documents. But the documents don't have an index file, but the parent ID has that employee ID. So I could actually use the spreadsheet as my document to trigger the OnBase process and have the output of that processor be the index file that would go into OnBase. And so I could double purpose that spreadsheet if I needed to. The big thing is I could actually process, even with a spreadsheet, all of those files by duplicating the rows now, because when I go to a folder for that employee, they might have 3 documents. I can import those as 3 separate OnBase documents using both the spreadsheet and the files in the directory. It is a console. Yes, just a console application. The application traverses the folders looking for files, and it can go into the subfolders so that I can get, if the directory structure is a little bit embedded, I can deal with that. For each file, I'm going to create a row and a text file with the employee number and the file name. Possibly hard code or work out some kind of logic for the document type. And then you remember that nice little mapping mechanism I had for the wrapper? I could reuse that here, but instead of using the MIME types, use file extensions, map the extensions to OnBase file formats. And so again, some configurability, but I can then tell what type of document I need to import. The application can be configured as a diff preprocessor. I can execute it using the %I, %O, which %I, %O, if you don't know, is input, output. You can run the preprocessor without diff a couple times to troubleshoot. And so with the preprocessors, I can actually execute those outside of OnBase just to see, do they work? Do they produce what I think they're going to? And you can create a log file, or if you're so inclined, you could even tap into the Unity API and do it to the diagnostics console. And you can even archive that log file if you're creating a log file to OnBase. And so not in the case of the specific example I was talking here, but in another case, I actually had that log file being archived to OnBase as well. I even had it getting imported into a workflow and notifying users if there were errors. Taking a step back and looking at another type of application, there's something called crawlers out there, specifically a directory crawler. Maybe a dip preprocessor isn't needed, but you have a directory of files that need to be processed. I had a customer here where they had an entire directory of files. They needed to process them. There were no index information or anything like that. And my first question to them is, are you positive they're all in the same format? And of course, they told me they are. Absolutely, we can process them. Here's what the file name structure is going to be. Here's what the folder structure is going to be. All of the documents fall into this structure. I created a crawler application that can traverse the directory and any subdirectories, look all the way through the tree, and find all those documents. I then verified the format of those files and that the files were where I expected them to be so that I could create an index file or I could import them directly into OnBase. I then actually created a log file for them so that they could see all the ones not fitting their naming convention. And where in fact they told me they all follow the exact same naming convention, there were easily north of 600 files that did not follow the format. The nice thing is with this crawler application, I could look through my log file and I found new patterns that I could add to my list of acceptable patterns to import those documents. And so where they told me a file might be named first name space last name, maybe I was getting first name dash last name. And I could see in the log file, oh, I need a dash or a space. Or maybe I need to account for if they put their middle initial. And so I could kind of look at that log file and start eliminating any nuances with the file form, with the file names. It ended up taking a few iterations, but we got it down to a very acceptable level where somebody could manually go and change the rest of the documents. And so in this case, it took a few iterations, but we were able to get the documents imported, and we're still working on this particular application. One of my last examples, and one of my favorite, OnBase scripting. It's another way to extend the value of your investment. Anyone on the phone here listening knows that they have an investment in the OnBase software. Scripting inside of the software, it is so huge to extend that investment. I can do so many things just from the comforts of OnBase to reach out to other applications, do custom processing and things like that. A case study here is some WorkView scripting. I am absolutely a huge fan of WorkView. It is a great application that can easily be extended. In this case, a customer has a mainframe which logs history of all the actions that they do. The application is moving to be WorkView, but that history still needs to be kept in the mainframe. And so whenever the customer updates a field in the WorkView, they want to send that information over to the mainframe. As luck would have it, the mainframe has a REST interface. And I swear I know that word from somewhere. I need to call that REST interface on some action taken in WorkView. But wait, WorkView has scripting capabilities built in. With the WorkView application, I can actually write a script that takes an action when an object is saved. And so when you go and save that object, I can even grab what values have changed by using the OnBase API. And so I know the minute you click save, what changed on that object. I can use the REST call to transfer the data to the mainframe. And now both systems are going to be integrated through that code base. A user will only have to go into WorkView, but their actions are going to update both of those both the OnBase application and that mainframe simultaneously. And so it really does come down to imagination is your only limitation. If you have the OnBase APIs licensed, a programmer available to you, and an OnBase implementer, just about anything's possible. And so are there any other questions that anyone would like to get in? You can ask me now, or you can always contact me later. Seriously, I love talking about possibilities when it comes to code, so I am never shy, and I will be very honest on what the effort is and give any kind of tips I can on how to go about any types of integrations or customizations. And so are there any questions out there?
We do not have any other questions yet. We will leave it open for a few more minutes, but that was super informative. I learned a few things. I appreciate that, Victor.
Absolutely.
I can think of a few customers on the call even that might have some great ideas of use cases for some of the things that you shared with us.
I hope so. I hope I get to work with them.
We'll see if we can play some individual rounds of Stump the Geek. So one of the questions that that has popped in is, can you just recap for us? We talked about REST APIs, we talked about the TSC wrapper. Can you comment a little bit about use cases or pros and cons of each, or how you would kind of give people an initial way to categorize which tool you go for at what time?
In terms of the TSC wrapper versus creating your own, or the REST API?
Sorry, the Hyland APIs versus the wrapper.
So the best comparison I could have is if you have a OnBase API certified person or somebody reasonably versed in the OnBase APIs, you could possibly write your own wrapper and proceed in that manner. If you don't have a OnBase API developer per se, the wrapper makes it so that it's so much like any other web call that I would highly recommend that customer talk to us and look at the wrapper and see if that couldn't meet their needs, because it's a lot less work on understanding the OnBase API structure and the licensing and things like that, where I can hide some of that in the wrapper and now that programmer is just calling it, than trying to learn basically OnBase to be able to program to OnBase using the APIs.
So Victor, on that question, if they were talking about the specific Hyland REST API, the latest, the newest one that's out, the pros and cons to that versus the TSC wrapper, if I understood you correctly, is one, the Hyland REST API is fairly new, kind of limited, but the one part that you alluded to was all the extra items you need in order to get that to work. Is that really the kind of the con between the being so new and all the other items compared to the TSC wrapper and the Unity?
Yeah, that's kind of the big thing I'd tell a customer is the TSC wrapper is going to use the Unity API. If you're using the OnBase modules, those are already using that application server. If you're going to go use the Hyland REST API, there's going to be some overhead of putting together all those components, testing them to make sure they talk to each other, and things like that, where it is going to be a little bit of extra time just to set up that API.
And one of the things we noticed on our last project when we were working with the Hyland REST API is that you have to, like Victor was saying, set up the Hyland IDP server, and you have to have things set up a specific way. And it is very limited on what versions of .NET Core that you have to work with. So we feel like there's a lot more flexibility with the TSC wrapper, not to mention it's been around a long time compared to the new REST stuff. But based on our experience, and before Hyland went to the simplified pricing model, the REST API was yet another huge cost, and the Unity API was not bad at all. And now that we have the simplified pricing, there's a lot of different components that you have to put together, which could cause to have more servers, which could also cause more cost in your whole solution. So thanks, Victor. I think that was what the question was about.
Sure.
Great stuff. I don't have any other questions in the list currently, and we certainly are available for follow-up afterwards too. So
Excellent.
Can you go to the next slide?
Yeah, absolutely. Just did.
awesome. Thanks, Victor. That was really, really educational for me, hopefully for everybody else who attended as well. Before we let you go, we appreciate, again, your time this afternoon, everyone who joined us. Please let us know if you have questions, if you want to talk about managed services, if you want to talk about ideas of how you may be able to use some of the tools that we've talked about today. And any of those things, we would love to talk to you about it. So feel free to reach out directly. We also look forward to you hopefully joining us for our next in our webinar series. We've got a couple of them listed here. January, we're going to be talking about use cases for public defenders. And in February, we're going to be talking about road mapping towards that goal of utopia of paperless, not efficiencies in ECM 101. So we look forward to seeing those suggestions come our way. If you have other ideas about what you'd like to talk about, Heather will be looking for those in her inbox. You see her email here. And then we did have another question right before we wrap up. So we had a question about API type, and I don't have a bunch of details. So if you'd like to elaborate or connect with us offline, we would love to answer that in some more detail.
Sure.
Great. Well, I think that wraps our time for today. So we really do appreciate your time. Thank you for your attendance. As always, we exist here at TSC to help you achieve the most from your OnBase investment. That's what we do and what we care about. So we would love to put our imaginations together going forward. Thanks and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.